Some people don't look evil. They look calm, controlled, intelligent. They smile at the right time, say the right words, and still leave destruction behind them. The most dangerous people are not the loud ones. They're the ones who know exactly how to hide their intentions while studying yours. And if you miss these 5 behaviors, you may not realize who they are until they've already taken something from you. One of the most chilling behaviors you will ever witness is not rage, violence, or cruelty. It is emotional emptiness disguised as normal behavior. Most people assume evil announces itself loudly, but in reality, the most dangerous individuals are often emotionally composed, socially intelligent, and disturbingly calm in moments where normal humans would feel discomfort. Watch closely when someone is standing in front of pain they caused. A healthy mind experiences friction. Even the strongest personalities reveal microsignals of internal conflict, tension around the eyes, changes in breathing, hesitation in speech, subtle guilt leaking through body language. Human empathy is difficult to suppress completely because it is wired deeply into survival and connection. But so, people learn how to imitate emotion without actually feeling it. That is where things become dangerous. They know exactly when to look concerned, when to lower their voice, when to pause dramatically, when to mirror sadness. But if you pay attention long enough, something feels cold underneath it. The reaction is technically correct, yet emotionally hollow. And most people miss this because humans are trained to listen to words more than behavior. A manipulative person understands this weakness instinctively. They know society rewards appearances more than authenticity. So instead of developing conscience, they develop performance. That is why certain individuals can betray friends, humiliate partners, destroy trust, and then calmly eat dinner an hour later as if nothing happened. It is not emotional strength. It is emotional absence. The disturbing part is that emotionally detached people often appear more powerful than emotionally healthy people because they are not weighed down by guilt, empathy, or inner conflict. In negotiations, relationships, leadership, and even everyday social interactions, they can appear unusually composed under pressure. But calmness without conscience. ECE is not maturity. It is predatory efficiency. Real emotional control still contains humanity. Emotional emptiness does not. Watch how some people react when others are vulnerable. Healthy individuals instinctively soften around pain. Emotionally detached individuals often become more attentive, more curious, sometimes even more energized. Why? Because vulnerability gives them information. It exposes fears, insecurities, and emotional pressure points they may later use for influence or control. This is why some people leave conversations feeling strangely drained without understanding why. Their nervous system detected something their conscious mind could not explain. Humans evolved to recognize emotional authenticity long before language existed. Your instincts notice emotional deadness faster than your logic does. But modern people are trained to ignore intuition in favor of politeness. They explain away cold behavior. They rationalize manipulation. They confuse charm with goodness because charm feels socially comfortable. Yet some of the darkest personalities on earth survive specifically because they understand how to appear safe. And the truly unsettling truth is this: many emotionally detached people are not hiding their nature at all. They reveal it constantly through patterns, reactions, and behavioral inconsistencies. The problem is that most people only recognize danger once damage becomes personal. By then, trust has already been weaponized against them. This is why awareness matters more than intelligence. Intelligence can be manipulated. Emotion can be exploited. But deep behavioral awareness allows you to see what words are trying to hide. Because the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the loudest one. It is often the calm individual who can watch suffering without feeling anything at all. Silence becomes dangerous when it stops being absence and starts becoming control. Most people think silence is passive, but in human behavior, silence is often one of the most aggressive psychological tools a person can use. Weak individuals talk to release tension. Emotion spills out of them uncontrollably because they need validation, reassurance, or dominance. But emotionally calculated people understand something deeper. The person who controls the emotional temperature of a conversation usually controls the people inside it. That is why some individuals suddenly become quiet at very specific moments, not because they have nothing to say, but because they know silence creates psychological pressure. Watch what happens when someone goes cold during conflict. The average person begins panicking internally. Their brain starts searching for answers, explanations, signs of rejection, danger, or disapproval. Human beings are wired to fear social disconnection because, historically, isolation meant vulnerability and death. A manipulative person instinctively understands this ancient survival mechanism. They know that silence forces the other person to emotionally chase them. And once someone begins chasing emotionally, they stop thinking clearly. This is why silent treatment is so psychologically powerful. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the fastest ways to destabilize the human mind. The brain hates unfinished emotional situations. It craves closure. So when someone suddenly withdraws emotion, eye contact, affection, or communication, the other person often begins over-explaining, apologizing, confessing, or emotionally exposing themselves just to end the tension. Meanwhile, the silent person gathers information. Ion. They study reactions. They measure insecurity. What looks like emotional control is sometimes calculated observation. You can see this in interrogations, negotiations, relationships, even everyday conversations. The calmest person in the room is often the one forcing everyone else to reveal themselves first. That is not accidental. Silence makes people uncomfortable because silence removes predictability. Most humans feel safer around emotional noise, even if the noise is unhealthy. At least noise gives information. Silence gives imagination space to operate. And imagination is often crueler than reality. That is why emotionally intelligent manipulators rarely yell first. Yelling exposes emotion. Silence conceals it. And concealed emotion creates mystery, authority, and psychological imbalance. You see it in toxic relationships where one partner suddenly withdraws communication after conflict, forcing the other person into emotional desperation. You see it in leaders who pause deliberately before speaking because they understand tension increases attention. You even see it in social groups where the quiet individual becomes strangely influential simply because others project one. Intelligence, power, or emotional depth onto their silence. Humans naturally fill silence with assumptions, and manipulative personalities know this better than most people realize. But there is another layer most people never notice. Sometimes silence is not about controlling others. Sometimes it is about hiding emptiness. Some individuals remain quiet because prolonged conversation exposes the absence beneath the performance. The less they speak emotionally, the harder they are to read. Mystery becomes camouflage. This is why emotionally dangerous people often reveal themselves indirectly through timing rather than words. Notice when silence appears. Does it create reflection, or does it create anxiety? Does it calm the room, or psychologically dominate it? Because healthy silence feels safe. Manipulative silence feels heavy. Your nervous system knows the difference before your conscious mind does. And one of the most important behavioral truths you will ever learn is this. When someone uses silence to make you abandon your emotional balance, they are no longer communicating with you, they are conditioning you. Confusion is one of the most underestimated tools in human behavior. Because it doesn't look like an attack, it looks like a mistake. Most people imagine control as force, pressure, or direct manipulation, but the more advanced form of influence is far quieter. It works by disrupting clarity just enough that a person can no longer trust their own interpretation of events. When clarity breaks, confidence breaks with it, and once confidence is gone, people begin outsourcing their judgment to whoever appears most stable in the situation. This is where behavioral manipulation becomes almost invisible. A person does not need to lie constantly or argue aggressively. They only need to introduce small contradictions, subtle shifts in meaning, or emotional inconsistencies that force the other person to keep recalibrating their understanding. You see this in conversations where someone says something supportive in one moment, then acts distant in the next without explanation. The brain immediately tries to resolve the inconsistency. Was it something I said? Did I misunderstand? Am I overreacting? That internal questioning is where control begins to form. Because once a person starts doubting their own perception, they stop focusing on the other person's behavior. And start focusing on their own internal instability. This is a critical shift. It turns external observation into self-analysis. And when attention turns inward like that, it becomes much easier to influence the emotional state of the other person without resistance. In everyday life, this can appear very subtle. A friend who gives mixed signals of loyalty and distance. A partner who alternates between affection and withdrawal without explanation. A coworker who praises your work but later undermines your confidence with vague criticism that cannot be clearly challenged. None of these actions feel extreme on their own, but together they create cognitive tension. The human brain is not designed to hold contradiction comfortably for long periods, so it tries to resolve it quickly. And in that rush for resolution, people often lower their boundaries, accept unclear explanations, or adjust their behavior just to restore emotional stability. That is the hidden mechanism. Confusion does not force compliance directly, it creates discomfort that people eventually escape by complying voluntarily. This is why highly manipulative individuals rarely present themselves as fully predictable or fully transparent. Predictability gives others leverage. Total transparency gives others control. Instead, they operate in controlled inconsistency. Just enough warmth to maintain trust, just enough distance to create uncertainty. This balance keeps the other person engaged, mentally occupied, and emotionally reactive. And when someone is emotionally reactive, they are no longer fully analytical. They are responding, not observing. That is the shift where influence becomes effective. In more extreme cases, confusion can be used to reshape memory itself. When events are described differently over time, or emotional reactions are dismissed as exaggeration, a person may begin to doubt their own recollection. This is not always intentional, but when it is, it becomes a powerful form of psychological dominance. Because a person who no longer trusts their memory will eventually rely on the version of reality provided by someone else. That is the end goal of confusion-based influence. Not control through force, but control through dependency on interpretation. And once someone starts believing that their clarity is unreliable, they stop trusting their instincts in general. At that place, influence no longer needs to be applied aggressively because the mind is already conditioned to seek external validation before forming judgment. The most dangerous part is how normal it can appear. It doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like misunderstanding, miscommunication, or emotional complexity. But the internal effect is consistent. Doubt replaces certainty, and certainty is where human resistance lives. Remove certainty, and resistance collapses without a fight. That is why confusion is not just a communication issue, it is a psychological environment where control grows silently, one doubt at a time. And once a person realizes they have been living inside that kind of uncertainty, the hardest truth to accept is this. It was never about what they didn't understand, it was about what they were slowly trained not to trust. Human beings don't reveal their true intentions through words first, they reveal them through what they notice. Attention is the real fingerprint of character. Long before someone acts, long before they decide, their mind is already filtering the world in a very specific way. Some people look at others and naturally notice strengths, emotions, or context. Others look and immediately scan for weakness, leverage, and emotional openings. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything about how a person interacts with reality. A person who studies weakness does not need to announce it. You can see it in how they listen. They interrupt less, not out of respect, but out of calculation. They let others speak more than necessary because every extra sentence is information. Tone, hesitation, contradictions, emotional spikes, all of it becomes data. Most people think conversation is about exchange, but for someone who operates strategically, conversation is extraction. And the more emotionally open the other person becomes, the more precise the mapping becomes. This is why highly manipulative individuals often appear unusually interested in your personal life early on. Not because they care in the traditional sense, but because human vulnerability follows patterns. If someone learns what you fear, what you lack, and what you crave emotionally, then they can help you overcome your fears, fill your gaps, and bring you closer to your dreams. They don't need to guess how to influence you later, they simply need to trigger the right internal response. That is why early deep connection can sometimes feel intense, but slight. Lie too fast, almost like someone is emotionally syncing with you before trust has fully developed. What is actually happening is observation disguised as intimacy. In real-world behavior, you can see this in subtle ways. A person remembers not just what you said, but how you reacted when you said it. They notice which topics make your voice tighten, which compliments you accept too quickly, and which criticisms you silently carry longer than you admit. They are not always conscious of this process, but the pattern recognition becomes automatic over time. And once a person builds a psychological map of another individual, they can then use that map to understand their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Influence becomes significantly easier because they are no longer guessing, they are testing known pressure points. This is why some interactions feel strangely accurate, as if the other person knows you slightly better than they should. It is not intuition, it is observation multiplied over time. The most dangerous part of this behavioral pattern is that it rarely looks threatening in the beginning. It often appears as attentiveness, curiosity, or emotional intelligence. But intent is not visible in the early stage, only behavior is. And behavior can be shaped, or controlled. That is why awareness requires more than just listening to words, it requires tracking consistency between attention and action. Do they notice your strengths, or only your insecurities? Do they remember your growth, or only your weaknesses? Do they engage with your full identity, or only the parts that can be influenced? These are not obvious questions in the moment, but they define the long-term direction of any relationship. Because whoever controls what they observe about you eventually controls what they can trigger in you. And once a person learns enough about how you respond under emotional pressure, they can develop the skills to handle stress and anxiety. They no longer need to push hard, they only need to apply the right signal at the right time. That is the hidden architecture of behavioral influence. Attention first, pattern recognition second, and control becomes almost effortless after that. Most people never realize they are being studied until their reactions are already predictable. And by then, the illusion of spontaneity is gone, replaced by something far more unsettling, the feeling that someone has quietly learned how you work better than you have ever understood yourself. And the moment you are no longer unpredictable, you are no longer fully free. Responsibility is one of the clearest psychological dividing lines between emotionally healthy individuals and those who operate through control, avoidance, or manipulation. Most people think responsibility is about admitting mistakes, but in behavioral terms, it goes much deeper than that. True responsibility is the willingness to remain psychologically exposed when outcomes are unfavorable. It is the ability to say, "This happened because of me," without immediately reaching for a justification that protects identity. And that is exactly where you see the difference in human behavior. When something goes wrong, some individuals naturally move toward clarity. They analyze their role, accept discomfort, and adjust behavior. But others immediately begin constructing alternative narratives. Not always lies in a direct sense, but subtle shifts in framing that move attention away from their role and towards circumstances, other people, or timing. This is not random. It is identity protection, because for many individuals, being wrong does not feel like a simple correction, it feels like a threat to self-worth. So instead of absorbing accountability, they redistribute it. You can observe this in everyday interactions. A missed commitment becomes miscommunication. A harmful action becomes taken out of context. Emotional impact becomes overreaction. Each of these linguistic shifts serves the same psychological purpose: distance the self from consequence. The more a person avoids responsibility, the more fragile their internal stability becomes, because their sense of self is no longer grounded in reality, but in protection. And when identity depends on protection, truth becomes flexible. In more advanced behavioral patterns, this avoidance becomes almost invisible. The person may still sound reasonable, even calm, even thoughtful. They may acknowledge some part of the issue, but always in a way that preserves control over how they are perceived. This partial accountability is important to understand. It creates the illusion of maturity while maintaining emotional insulation. Meanwhile, the other person in the interaction is often left carrying the emotional weight of the situation alone. Over time, this creates imbalance. One person adapts, reflects, and internalizes. The other deflects, reframes, and externalizes. This dynamic is not always conscious, but it is consistent, and consistency is where behavioral truth lives. In relationships, this pattern becomes especially clear. When conflict occurs, emotionally grounded individuals move toward repair. They want resolution even if it is uncomfortable. But emotionally avoidant or manipulative individuals often move toward narrative control. Who is right becomes less important than who is believed. Because belief shapes reality in social environments more than truth does. If you can control perception, you can control outcome without ever resolving the underlying issue. That is why accountability is so powerful and so avoided. It removes narrative control and forces alignment with reality. And reality, unlike perception, does not bend to comfort. Another subtle layer appears in how some individuals respond to feedback. Healthy behavior treats feedback as data. Defensive behavior treats feedback as identity attack. That difference determines whether someone grows or becomes increasingly resistant to correction. The more defensive a person becomes, the more distorted their internal worldview can become over time, because they are filtering reality through protection instead of observation. This leads to a quiet but dangerous outcome. A person who is increasingly disconnected from how their behavior actually affects others. And the less awareness they have of impact, the easier it becomes to repeat patterns without correction. This is why responsibility is not just moral, it is psychological grounding. It anchors perception to reality. Without it, a person can remain socially functional on the surface while internally constructing a version of themselves that cannot withstand truth. And in relationships, work, or influence, this creates a hidden instability that eventually surfaces through repeated conflict, confusion, or emotional distance. The uncomfortable truth is that many of the most persistent human problems are not caused by lack of intelligence or lack of awareness, but by refusal to fully own impact. Because once you fully accept responsibility, you lose the ability to escape reality through narrative. And for many people, that loss feels more threatening than the consequences themselves. But the moment you stop defending your identity against truth is the moment you stop being controlled by IT. And that is the line most people never cross, because on the other side of responsibility is not blame, but clarity, and clarity demands that nothing about you is hidden from yourself anymore.